Rick Baker picked up the phone and dialed. He was grasping at straws, and he knew it, but the story was just too strange to let go. A woman without a name, imprisoned for 50 years without a charge, an unmarked grave, a paper trail that led nowhere. A phone number and the name Harry Sizer were his only leads. Harry Sizer wasn't eager to talk, but Baker asked his question anyway. "Do you know anything about the disappearance of Alice Sizer?" "Her name was Anna Sizer," the man replied. "How do you know that?" Harry Sizer paused. Baker could sense his reluctance, though he didn't yet understand it. "She was my sister," he said, after a moment. "Do you have any idea what happened to her?" Baker asked. "Why do you want to know?" "I'm a reporter from Illinois," Baker said. "A lady died down here recently and nobody knows who she was. I'm trying to find out." "It's not my sister," Sizer answered. Baker was baffled by the lack of interest. Something didn't add up. Maybe he wasn't grasping at straws after all. In fact, the more he pressed Sizer for answers and got nowhere, the more convinced he became that this man held the key. Finally, Harry Sizer asked the million-dollar question. What happened to the woman who died down there? Baker couldn't answer. The story of Mary Doefour was too tragic and too bizarre to tell over the phone to a stranger who definitely knew more than he let on. On March 2nd, 1978, Rick Baker was working on a story for a small Illinois newspaper when he was interrupted by a phone call from the local undertaker. Baker knew what that meant. He would have to take a break from his latest scoop to write an obituary. No task could be duller or more repetitive for an investigative journalist, but this obituary request was unlike any other Baker had ever received. No one knew anything about the deceased. This was all Baker had to go on. An elderly woman named Mary Doe had suffered a heart attack and died in the night at the Queenwood East Nursing Home in Morton, Illinois. The undertaker told him she was probably in her 70s or 80s. Probably? What did that mean? Baker asked her date of birth. Unknown. Place of birth. Unknown. Education. Profession. Unknown. Any surviving family or friends? A spouse? Anyone at all who would mourn for her? Unknown. 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 On top of everything else, Baker was told that Mary Doefour wasn't actually her real name. It was an alias assigned by the state. Mary Doefour. Unknown woman number 4. A question mark masquerading as a name. Baker was perplexed, but the undertaker couldn't tell him any more. Mary's body had already been cremated. All he could do was store her ashes on a shelf until someone claimed them, or until time ran out and the state had her buried in an anonymous grave. Being a reporter, Baker was intrigued by the mystery of Mary Doefour. Someone had to know who she was, where she came from and when. She didn't just fall from the sky. Baker took a drive out to the Queenwood Nursing Home in search of anyone who'd actually known Mary. The scene that awaited him was haunting. The halls of Queenwood echoed with a chorus of broken hymns sung by the patients. While they prayed, Baker managed to track down the resident therapist. When he asked her about Mary, she choked up. The therapist had known Mary well, or as well as anyone could. She knew Mary's story, too. Bits and pieces she'd been told, fragments from Mary's shockingly incomplete official file, a record stretching back 50 years. The story she told Rick Baker left him shaken. All those doctors and nurses. How was it possible that none of them had taken a closer look at Mary's case? They'd had 50 years to notice something was terribly wrong. The neglect and abuse was unimaginable. All of it endorsed and funded by the state. This is the story Rick Baker unearthed. On a fine summer's day, a beautiful young woman stumbles along the side of a road in northern Illinois. She's dazed and disoriented, naked and bleeding. A passerby spots her and contacts the authorities. They discover that she's been savagely attacked and assaulted. Even more troubling, she has no memory. She can't even recall her own name. The authorities are uneasy. This woman has no identification and no money. She's suffering from acute amnesia. She's committed no crime, but they can't just turn her loose. That wouldn't be right. Maybe they could figure out who she is and where she comes from. return her to her family. But that would require work. Paperwork too. And work, as we all know, is hard. So instead, they lock her in the Menteno State Hospital for the criminally insane, despite the fact she's not a criminal, and she's not insane. At Menteno, she's assigned the alias Mary Doe. Doctors quickly discover that Mary is pregnant. She's forced to give birth while imprisoned there, but she never sees the child. It's taken from her as soon as it's born, and likely sent to an orphanage. Mary never hears about or from her child again. She doesn't even know whether it's a boy or girl. In the early years of her imprisonment, staff find Mary to be pleasant, articulate, and well-educated. But as time goes on, Mary begins to protest that she doesn't belong in a prison for the criminally insane. None of the psychiatric staff seem interested in discovering her true identity or in helping her to regain her memory. The only thing Mary can recall about her previous life is that she once worked as an elementary school teacher. She's fairly certain that she taught first grade. When Mary asks if she can be released, doctors medicate her to keep her calm and pliant. She's pumped full of drugs until she shakes. She's subjected to frequent rounds of electroshock therapy, sometimes to the point of blacking out. When she does lose consciousness, staff revive her by dousing her in cold water. After 10 years at Menteno, Mary is transferred to a state mental hospital in Bartonville. The staff change her name from Mary Doe to Mary Doefour, because they already have 3 other Mary Does on the ward. At Bartonville, this once pleasant, intelligent woman is allowed to deteriorate completely. Denied access to a washroom, Mary relieves herself on the floor. On occasions when she does have access to a toilet, she uses it as a sink. Mary Doefour is held in Bartonville Mental Hospital for 30 years. In that time, she receives no visitors and is subjected to constant sedation and electroshock therapy. In 1972, the state closes Bartonville, and Mary is transferred to the nursing home system, first in El Paso, then in Morton, Illinois. The latter home is where she passes away in 1978, never having recovered her freedom or her memory. This is the outline of the 14-page story Rick Baker published in the Bloomington Pantagraph in 1978, hoping someone might write in to identify Mary and claim her remains. But no one did. Rick Baker had made a valiant effort to solve a mystery everyone else overlooked for decades, but he came up empty. Or so he thought. 8 months later, an intriguing lead would come from an unlikely source, a lead that would blow the story wide open. Early in 1979, Rick Baker began writing for a larger paper, the Peoria Journal-Star. Shortly after he started, his editor took him aside and asked about the Mary Doefour case. Baker said it had been months since he'd thought about it, but his new editor was interested in the story. The deadline for someone to claim Mary's remains was only 6 weeks away. After that, she'd be buried in a pauper's grave. If they published a follow-up story to a wider readership, someone might still come forward with information identifying Mary once and for all. Rick Baker's second story ran on the front page. It was picked up by the Associated Press and ran prominently in several other Midwest newspapers as well. Baker felt certain someone would write in with a tip, but he only received 3 letters, none of which seemed helpful at first glance. The first was from a woman who wrote Baker simply to say how sad she found the story. The second was a complaint that the newspaper's poor printing made the article hard to read. The third letter came from a woman in Mount Vernon, Iowa. She remarked that the story of Mary Doefour reminded her of a local woman named Alice who went missing around 1930. Baker was exasperated. As he put it, the best thing to do seemed to be to buy some beer, go home and watch television, and try to forget about Mary Doefour. But the story had its hooks in Baker, and it wouldn't let go. After a week of letting the story lie, he re-examined the letter he received from Iowa. It wasn't much to go on, but he decided it was at least worth some digging. One detail in particular stood out. According to the letter writer, this Alice had been a school teacher. Baker started there. He called an elementary school in Mount Vernon and asked the secretary if she'd ever heard anything about a teacher who'd gone missing 50 years earlier. The secretary said that she hadn't, but promised to ask around. Amazingly, she called Baker back and told him several school staff vaguely remembered that a teacher disappeared from Mount Vernon around 1930. They thought her name was Alice Sizer, not Zizer. The secretary had no further information, but she gave Baker the name and number of a man who she thought was a relation of the missing teacher. A man named Harry Sizer. That brings us back to the beginning, to Rick Baker's call with Harry Sizer, who seemed strangely uninterested in the possibility that a reporter may have identified his long-lost sibling. Not only uninterested, Baker found, but borderline standoffish. "Nobody's heard from my sister for more than 50 years, Sizer told him. "My parents died waiting to hear from her. My brothers died. Nobody heard from this lady either," Baker said. "Do you have any idea what happened to your sister?" "She got off a train in Marion, Iowa. Someone saw her get off. That was the fall of 1926, and we haven't heard a word of her since." Sizer told Baker that the family had hired detectives to search for his sister as far as California, but they never found any trace of her. Rick Baker was anxious for answers. He'd been living with the mystery of Mary Doefour for the better part of a year, and now he was almost certain he was speaking to her brother. After all, how many school teachers randomly went missing in the Midwest around the time Mary was found? "Do you have a picture of your sister?" Baker asked. "Yes," Sizer said. "I'd like to have it. If I can show it to a woman who knew the woman who died down here, we'll be able to tell if it was your sister." "It's been 50 years, answered Sizer. "She wouldn't look the same." "Yeah, but it's all I've got to go on," Baker said. "This could be your sister." After a while, Sizer finally agreed to think about sending the picture. "You don't have to send it," Baker said. "I'll come to Iowa and get it." Baker quickly secured funding from his editor to make the trip. In his mind, he would get a photo of Anna Merle Sizer, confirm she was Mary Doefour, and put the story to bed. But, as so often in this case, things would prove more complicated. Baker paid a visit to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and went digging in the archives of the city's newspaper, looking for old stories about the disappearance of Anna Sizer. He struck gold, sort of. He found plenty of reports about Anna's disappearance and the subsequent search, but the paper reported that Anna vanished in 1926, just as Harry Sizer had said. Mary Doefour's records indicated she was found in 1932. However, Baker unearthed two disturbing coincidences between the disappearance of Anna Sizer and the discovery of Mary Doefour. One, the last reported sighting of Anna placed her by the side of Interstate 30 between Cedar Rapids and Chicago. Mary was found wandering by the side of a road outside Chicago. 2. Newspaper reports indicated that Anna had recently suffered some sort of mysterious illness and warned that she may not be able to identify herself. There was another disturbing tidbit. The paper reported a man driving around Cedar Rapids looking for a room to rent. In his car, witnesses saw a woman he claimed was suffering a mental breakdown. She was wearing a black hat, the same as the one Anna Sizer was wearing when she went missing. Rick Baker also found a photo of Anna on microfilm in the archive, but he had no way to print it. If he wanted a picture to show to people who knew Mary, he'd have to get it from Harry Sizer. Baker dropped in on Harry Sizer and laid out the case that his sister was Mary Doefour. As strong as the evidence was, it made little impact. "I've got a heart condition," Harry said. "This certainly isn't doing that much good." Rick Baker prodded Harry, but gradually came to accept that he wasn't likely to cooperate. "My other sister and I have talked," Harry said, "and we won't accept that our sister may be this woman. We simply won't accept it." But Harry gave Rick Baker the photograph anyway. Baker raced back to Illinois, to the Queenwood East nursing home, to show the staff his find. The first person he showed the photo to was Hilda Heron, a nursing aide who'd spent several years caring for Mary. Heron stared at the photo for a full minute. Finally, she said, "This is Mary Doefour. I'd bet anything on it." The head of nurses looked at the photo and agreed. She pointed out that both women had wavy hair, a round face, sloped shoulders, and a slightly wide nose. They also both had a vaccination scar in the same place. Baker asked another nurse who knew Mary Doefour about a detail that had been troubling him. The dates were inconsistent. In some files, Mary Doefour was reported to have been found in 1928, and in others 1932. Anna Sizer went missing in 1926. The nurse assured him that the file must be wrong. Anna Sizer was Mary Doefour. She was sure of it. Rick Baker's editor was less sure. Baker couldn't believe it. His editor refused to run the story as it was. There were too many holes, too many other possibilities. If he wanted to solve the mystery of Mary Doefour officially, he would have to go back to where Mary's story began, as far as he knew, the Manteno Mental Hospital. Located south of Chicago, the Manteno Hospital was like a small town unto itself, comprised of endless red brick buildings. Mary Doefour spent 10 torturous years imprisoned there. In her time, Manteno was home to 9,000 people. When Rick Baker visited in 1979, fewer than 900 patients remained. The place was like a ghost town, filled with unhappy spirits. Baker hoped to find someone at Manteno who might remember Mary and connect her to Anna Merle Sizer. Of the few employees who had worked there 4 decades earlier, none remembered Mary. Back then, there was one staff for every 155 patients, a nurse told him. In fact, Baker found there had been 19 Mary Does at Manteno over the years, women who either couldn't give their names or wouldn't. Baker checked the files, hoping to find a photo of a young Mary Doefour that he could match to Anna Sizer, but all the photos had been burned long ago. The only potential trace of Mary was a pile of index cards containing sparse details of the various Mary Does who had passed through Manteno. None of them seemed to connect to Anna Sizer or Mary Doefour. Baker asked John Steinmetz, the assistant superintendent of Manteno, how that was possible. "If it's any comfort to you," Steinmetz said, "the records that exist from back then have no credibility whatsoever." Baker asked him about the discrepancy in dates. Anna Sizer went missing in 1926, but there was no record of Mary until 1932. "She couldn't have been here since 1926, said Steinmetz. "This place didn't exist in 1926. It wasn't here until 1932. She was probably transferred here from someplace." That insight triggered another startling breakthrough in the case. Steinmetz and Baker were able to confirm that a woman had been transferred to Manteno in 1932 from a state hospital in Kankakee, Illinois, a woman who couldn't remember her name. They still had a file that might contain the proof Baker needed to end the story at last, but to access the information he needed, he would have to ask for Harry Sizer's help one more time. Rick Baker had the photos. He had located the file of the woman he was certain was Mary Doefour, but he couldn't see it. Mental health records are private and can't be released without the permission of the patient. But Mary Doefour was dead, so in her place, a member of her family could request the files be released. All they would have to do was appeal to a judge. Rick Baker contacted a journalist friend who was also a lawyer. He looked at the evidence Baker had assembled, indicating that Mary Doefour and Anna Sizer were the same person, and told Baker the odds were good that a judge would unseal her record if a family member sued the state. The lawyer agreed to handle the suit free of charge. All Rick Baker had to do was convince Harry Sizer to lodge the suit. He made another trip to Iowa to see Harry Sizer, and this time he laid out all the evidence. Anna and Mary both had been teachers. Both had the same wavy hair and round face. Both had blue eyes. Both had the same vaccination scar in the same place. Anna Sizer went missing between Cedar Rapids and Chicago. Mary Doefour was found outside Chicago. The photos had been identified as the same woman by multiple people who had known Mary for years. The file containing the final pieces of evidence was there. All they had to do was ask for it. Harry Sizer reacted furiously. He refused the lawyer's assistance, saying, "This is just rubbing salt in the wounds. I don't want anything more to do with it. I want the picture of my sister back." The full force of Harry Sizer's grief hit Rick Baker. He and his family had long since accepted Anna's disappearance. They'd concluded that she was murdered decades earlier. As horrible as it was, they'd made their peace with it. They'd said goodbye. The thought that Anna may have been alive all that time, imprisoned, suffering, with no memory of them or her life before, was too painful to contemplate. No amount of evidence would ever make him accept the possibility. Rick Baker went back to Illinois, confident that Anna Sizer was Mary Doefour, but never quite certain. He realized his investigation had done the Sizer family more harm than good, and he never troubled them again. But the story of Mary Doefour has continued to resonate. Was Anna Sizer really Mary Doefour? Or is it possible that what happened to Mary happened to others as well? That more people fall through the cracks than we'd like to believe?